Okay, guys, this is History After Hours podcast. It is March the 7th. Was that correct?
Yep.
And we are live at Collective Coffee with about 37 students looking energetic and ready to roll. So,
they're jacked up on coffee.
who's got our first question? Over here, we have a question ready to
Here we
roll.
go. All right.
My name is Kayla Streepy, and my question is, do y'all have any weird talents?
Hidden novelties about anyone on the panel? What's your weird talent, Kevin?
I don't know. I could stick my shoulder blades out. I could I beatbox to a degree.
It was like, like wings.
Like stuff like that. I don't know.
I don't know that I have any talents, so I mean, I certainly don't have any weird ones.
Weird talents, yeah.
Yeah.
I have multiple people living in my head. Does that count? That's
No,
weird, right?
That's weird. Yeah.
It's like that's why I tell people in class, I'm not crazy. Just some of the people in my head are.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, sorry.
Okay.
I play
That
drums.
was a good question anyway.
That's not really a weird talent. I was a power lifter.
I was once named the professor of funk.
Professor.
I was once named the professor
there
of
you go.
funk.
All right.
Actually, I won a professorship. It was the John K. Funk professorship.
Yeah.
And when I won it, I said, I will accept this with the understanding that from now on, I will call myself the professor of funk, and I have a certificate to prove it. And I do display that certificate rather
It's
prominently.
like Dr. Love, Professor Funk.
Exactly,
It's gonna get
exactly.
funky.
Dr. Thrasher, professor of funk.
Everybody clap your hands.
And I have the paperwork to prove it.
That's
so
nice.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that counts. I'll go with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good one.
Yeah, don't be shy about that. That's cool.
Mr. Todd, do you have any?
I wish I could say I did, but no.
All right. Well, no weird talents.
Who next?
None that we can share.
Who would you guys consider, Edward Ivy? Who would you guys consider the most influential leader in history?
Leader.
In history. In American history or like world history? Just history. Just,
Muhammad.
like since people been writing stuff down, bro. Okay. Just answer the question, man. Why are you hassling me?
Muhammad.
Mom?
Yeah, personal influence.
He single-handedly created Islam and wrote the book on it, and then spread it halfway, around the Arabian Peninsula before he died. That's a lot to accomplish for one man. It's still going strong today. A billion people. I can't think. Maybe Newton, but Newton's not a scientist, so he's not a leader. I'd go Muhammad. Final answer.
Muhammad's a good answer. I'm going to go with my old favorite, Meiji. I think Meiji is a really good answer, not just for Japan, but for kind of shaping the landscape of Asia and East Asia and showing there's more than one way to deal with Western imperialism.
That's a very good answer. We just actually got through covering that in my 10th grade classes. So, yeah, to turn that around the way they did in a short amount of time, like 1850s, basically, America showed up and said, hey, we're going to take you over. And Japan says, okay, we don't know what to do. And then they figured out what to do. And they turned that around really quickly. So, yeah, that's a good answer as well. Geez. What do you think, Todd?
I mean, gosh, I hate to add to the Washington worship, but
But then don't.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I'm gonna because
Good.
he's definitely not the only person that could lead the Revolutionary War. But in that post-revolutionary environment, there are so many things in that early American history story that don't happen without Washington's support, because he's really kind of the linchpin to hold everybody else together. Without his support at the Constitutional Convention and willing to be the first president, we fall apart with infighting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If you had to take religion out of the mix, what would you say?
Ooh. One moment.
You're still going to go Muhammad because he was a political leader, too.
Oh, well, yeah. But,
Now, don't give
No.
him an out. I mean,
okay, let me think. Napoleon's up there for me. How about Cheops, the Egyptian pharaoh that had the Great Pyramid built, because it's going to be here for another.
Yeah.
People remember his name long after most everything else we know of today will have died.
Yeah.
They'll still remember, hey, who built that? Oh, yeah, it's like Neil Armstrong effect, right? There's always going to be the first human on the moon. That's not influential, maybe, but I guess if your name lasts for another 150,000 years, because
Yeah.
that pyramid's
Well,
still there.
That's pretty cool. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know. There's
still wait on your
so many people swirling in my head. I don't even really have a great answer because there's so many directions I could go. I like everything you guys said too, though. To be different, maybe the most influential.
Is Columbus a leader?
No,
No.
no. He got lucky.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Whew. Queen Victoria.
That's a good one.
Just throwing out another one, Hernan Cortez.
Yeah. He's kind of a criminal, though. And I mean, even at the time, he was kind of a criminal. He ran away from Cuba.
I mean, are we just taking
No,
criminals off the table? Because
No,
I kind of feel like that changes the
I mean, how many-
landscape a little.
But how many people did he actually lead? I mean,
But
I
the
mean, yeah,
ripple
well,
effect of conquering Central America,
Yeah.
that inspired. Wait a second.
Well,
that inspired Pizarro.
Well,
and-
then you have to count smallpox. Then he didn't lead smallpox into battle; it just kind of happened.
well, of course, he came because of Columbus too. But everybody, it's the father effect. How about Cortez's father? If it wasn't for him, there would be no Cortez. You could always go back forever. Okay.
Yep.
Did everybody say one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
I'm Ryan Sarden. This is more of a question for Mr. Pumphrey than anyone else because I don't know how many of you play guitar. But what's your favorite guitar pick and why?
Oh, I'm not too picky. I don't know. I like a whatever medium. I like those little jazz picks, the little red ones. I can go a little faster with those.
You
but
get
I'm not.
Ryan, you get a bonus question if you know. I mean, a bonus point if you actually know what the real name of that object is. It's not a pick. Like, what's it really called? Yeah. Plectrum. Who gave you the answer? There you go. All right. All right, here we go.
Jordan Lyle. Should the U.S. pull troops out of Iraq?
I got a similar question on the History After Hours thread about are we returning to an isolationist type? Is the United States, the huge empire that we've created after World War II, are we slowly on the path to reducing income? Similar.
Do we consider the question? Are we pulling troops out, or are we pulling out advisors who could help solidify the political process in the country? We got to think about both things. Maybe we're just exiting because that's isolationist. We exit completely and let them kind of deal with their problems. But
Right. So we talked about this a little bit last time, if I'm remembering right. But we cannot continue to live a life of a perpetual war. I mean, it's not ethically feasible. It's not monetarily feasible. There's no part about having troops in Iraq or Afghanistan for forever is the right way to go. But we are looking at having there's so many right ways to do it and so many wrong ways to do it. So to just have everybody gone tomorrow in a very Vietnam-esque manner is us, I think, ceding that kind of power. But just because we pull troops out of an area doesn't necessarily mean that we are ceding that hegemony and that influence around the world. So
let me play devil's advocate. In order for our economy to keep rolling, do we need a perpetual war? Have we created a military-industrial complex?
Oh, Eisenhower warned us about this.
Yeah, no question we have. Whether or not we need it or we could transition to something else.
How do you transition now that you've got billions of dollars and thousands of people who are dependent on those billions
Government
of dollars?
contracts all over the world.
I mean,
Sell the arms to somebody else.
yeah, but how do you transition those workers into some other field?
Well, no. What I'm saying is you can theoretically maintain the same production level. You just don't constantly kind of recycle through the American military with that equipment. You just start selling it to your new client states in Iraq and Afghanistan and everywhere else.
Well, why don't we do both?
I like how Democrats were all for kind of reducing our overseas stuff in the Middle East until Trump tried to do it. And then they're like, no.
Right.
You can do no right, so we're against that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not advocating that we should keep the perpetual war thing going, but it is a concern. Like,
Sure.
how do you minimize the negative effects of drawing that down, and are we able to transition people into something different? I mean, maybe that's a plan.
I mean, we can minimize it because you think about the tremendous investment that military represents that we could transition to something else, right? So that we could be just as big a job creator as long as we are taking that investment and putting it somewhere else.
Building walls.
Sure, if that's your project du jour.
It's not mine.
But we're going to be facing this very, very soon in so many different categories. So we are transitioning away from fossil fuels into renewables, and that's going to displace a lot of jobs. We are looking at driverless cars working its way into the tech sector, and you've got hundreds of thousands of truck driving jobs that pay six figures without a high school diploma, and now what are we going to do with all of them? So this kind of disruption is happening at a rate that we haven't seen since the initial Industrial Revolution. It's time to start seeking those solutions and not just being like, oh, well, no, the problems it's going to cause are too hard.
Have y'all heard the presidential candidate Andrew Yang?
Yes.
He scared the out of me when he was talking about 2030, like the driverless trucks. The top 5 paying jobs under, if you make $20 an hour or less, are all going to be automated in like 10 years. So it's like happening that fast. 30% of malls are going to close in the next like 5 years. I mean, we're in the middle of some transition that's crazy.
And the interesting thing about that is I hear all these gloom and doom stories, which may end up being correct, that we're going to have this massive unemployment. The thing is, the more that we have automation, the more that we have this kind of new industrialism, the unemployment rate is not going up, it's going down. So I don't know how to explain that exactly other than to say that somehow or another, I mean, I guess if you're being very optimistic and you're a big believer in the benefits of capitalism, you would suggest that any additional efficiency will create more jobs than it absolves. People will have more disposable income.
Obviously, there should be jobs creted from this madness.
Yes.
That's what always has happened in the past.
Yeah.
It's hard to predict that, though, because, I mean,
sure.
if we think back to the, let's go back to the Luddites who were losing their jobs to the threshing machines, and they rioted over those. We're losing our jobs. What are we going to do? Well, you can't necessarily foresee standing right here what those jobs of tomorrow may be. Like, they just sort of.
This is that learn to code.
They've sort of perpetually been there, and I wouldn't bet on that trend to end.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if, like, let's just say.
Not to say that's not worrisome, though.
Let's just say
losing your job.
the trucking industry within 10 years has to transition to driverless trucks. I mean, that's a good chunk of middle-aged men
Do you think it's realistically driverless, or you think that it's just driver light? Like, will the drivers? I mean, will there need to be a person in the vehicle to sort of override the system? They just don't actually have to do the physical labor itself. I mean, is that possible? Is that feasible? I mean,
I think they're toying with right now, like, dude in a room and can actually digitally beam himself into the truck and drive the truck if it comes up into a problem that the truck can't solve, an ethical situation. Like do I hit the old lady, or do I hit the school bus, or do I kill the driver? And then once the problem's solved, then he can beam back into a room. But once again, if I was a high school senior, I would be looking at the jobs likely to be automated first, which is generally speaking, repetitive manual labor type. Though there are jobs that are manual labor that it will be nearly impossible to automate.
Doesn't this all hinges on? And I've been hearing them talk about this more and more, like the new 5G platform, right?
Yeah.
So and I'm not sure. Like I saw it was like the CEO of Cisco, I think it was on the news the other day, talking about how they want to be a massive part of that. Obviously, whoever's going to control that. What's the Chinese company they're worried about? Huawei or whatever it is. Yeah, they're worried that they're going to be the ones who sort of dominate that market and then set it up to where nobody else can really compete with them very well. But I don't know. I mean, that's part of they're actually suing us based on that. They're thinking that we're discriminating against them. But 5G's coming apparently. Like, that's going to be what's the thing? Somebody help me. How much faster than 4G is the 5G going to be? Do you know? A lot faster. We'll say that's a technical term. Huh?
10 to 1,000.
Okay.
Wow, that's a whole order of magnitude.
So to answer your question, yes, we should slowly pull troops out of Iraq. All right, next question.
I'm Hayden Ringgold, and what do you think about the ongoing conflict of PewDiePie versus TSeries?
I don't even understand the words that just came out of your mouth. Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. I really don't know.
It's an Indian music corporation. It's basically the Disney of India.
Okay.
Has created a YouTube channel. It's become the most popular
that
rather
beca-
than a singular Swedish man who plays video games and reviews memes.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well.
The idea behind this is the corporate world is taking over what our world is on the internet. That's what the whole debate is.
Okay, well.
Yeah, I mean, there's anybody who thinks that our world hasn't already been taken over by major corporations in the internet is lying to themselves. But this is a cultural thing that, I mean, ultimately is much to do about nothing, right? There's no real cultural significance here. Because already those numbers are super hyperinflated from people creating 10,000 brand new accounts just so they can subscribe, and it's a meaningless number.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
Let him speak with authority on that. All right, here we go.
My name is Chase Hartzel, and my question is, who do you think is the most overrated president in history?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that question.
Yeah.
Overrated.
You mean of this country? Okay.
Overrated.
Well, I would probably say Thomas Jefferson, but I don't know how rated he is. I know he's famous.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, the ranking, I guess that's personal. A lot of people have their own favorites. And
I think if you ask an average American, they would think Thomas Jefferson was a great president, but he really wasn't. I wouldn't put him in the great category.
What's the detracting from him? The tariffs and all of that?
Well, yeah, the Embargo Act. He said he was going to change a bunch of stuff, and when he took over,
We're not going to have a national bank.
yeah, and he did the unconstitutional thing probably of buying the Louisiana Purchase, which he wrestled with, and that was probably good for our country, but so I don't know. I guess it just depends on. Jackson wasn't my favorite president. I think he gets a lot of credit for. I don't know. Y'all jump in. I could talk about this stuff forever.
I'm going to say JFK. Just
Oh,
based
yes.
on the fact that he wasn't in office very long,
That's a
and
great
he
answer.
started some really interesting, great ideas. He said, hey, let's go to the moon, which is a great idea, but he's not really responsible for getting us there, not even from the presidential leadership standpoint. So, yeah, I think he probably, and I think dying young and dying dramatically.
Do you think he gets sympathy points?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's just such a beautiful, tragic kind of story of this president with he's young and he's great ideals and he's this war hero and he's gonna take us to the moon, and then he gets struck down before he really has an opportunity to make much of it really happen.
Mm-hmm.
This very young, inspiring figure that was struck down, and you have the great what if. So yeah, and there's a lot of things I like about JFK, but I think he probably is rated much more highly than he should be by any objective measure.
That's a great answer.
I'm going to jump out on a limb and say Reagan.
You took the words out of my mouth. You did. I was going to
That's
do
another
the
great
exact
answer.
same thing.
It could be
Saint
a dangerous
Reagan.
thing to say because I know a lot of people love that guy. The memory of Reagan is just like this pristine sort of thing. But Reagan came with a lot of baggage. I mean, he had to change his position on a lot of things. Before he became governor of California, he had one very hardcore political stance. When he became governor of California, he had to moderate that stance, and then once he became president, then he moderated even more. But then I can also take with him the whole trickle down economics thing, and then you also throw in the beginnings of the Newt Gingrich stuff, and then you also have all the Latin American secrecy things, and then you throw in the Iran Contra.
And
there's
Gorbachev
so much.
Right.
doesn't get enough credit for ending the Cold War.
Right,
Yeah.
and his total just kind of no AIDS isn't a thing, and just let's
Right,
totally
yeah, that's,
ignore this thing is happening.
That's sketchy. I would also throw in the deregulation of the housing industry, deregulation of the banking industry, deregulation of Wall Street, which caused multiple collapses just as he was getting out of office that HW had to deal with, and that caused him to be a one-term guy. So, I mean,
Not dealing with the AIDS epidemic, the
I
crack,
think a lot of-
epidemic that we had in the 80s.
Yeah.
Right.
I think a lot of people give Reagan a pass, though, because, he was a movie star guy, and he did take a bullet, too, I suppose, right?
Yeah,
he
he
did.
did.
I mean,
Mhm.
I don't remember how long it took him to recover from that. And then by the end of his presidency, he's dealing with, what was he had? Did he have Alzheimer's? What was it?
He
I mean, I
did.
know
Alzheimer's.
that's not his
Yeah.
fault, but he was basically not able to function as well as people thought he was. And then so I think that the last, let's say, year or so was really kind of a sham. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, do people do the same kind of thing with him because they kind of want him to be great? Do you think that they do the same thing that you're talking about what they do with JFK? Like, do you get sympathy points maybe, or do you get some extra points for just being that charismatic?
I think it's the cult of personality.
Yeah.
I really do, and that he is speaking so firmly to that sense of American greatness that people so firmly
And we really
desperately
felt like
wanted
we
to
really
believe in.
needed that too after Vietnam. Like he
Yeah,
brought us out
absolutely.
of that slump.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I think people now with Trump are looking back on all the presidents a little bit gleefully. I mean, even Bush's his reputation has, well, that guy wasn't that bad, you know. And Obama, good grief, we might as well saint him too.
Everything's
by now.
relative.
Right.
So Obama, I think, is overrated, you know. So a lot of them are getting a little too much praise now with,
Don't you think
Sure.
the presidency itself is just kind of overrated as a position?
yes,
I mean,
too much blame, too much credit.
Well, you're right. That's what I'm saying. You get the credit for the good things, you get the blame for the bad things, or it gets overshadowed by the cult of personality, like you said, and we don't really have a true indicator of what those people, what they were actually doing.
Right. I think in a lot of ways the post-presidency almost speaks louder than their actual presidency. I mean, Jimmy Carter has been so much better a former president than he ever was a president.
Yeah,
And I think W is turning into the exact same kind of thing.
How so?
With his dedication to the troops or veterans and everything that he's doing with those organizations, and just the constant outreach that he's involved with is really inspiring, even though it's not getting as much press as it probably deserves.
Okay, very good.
My name is Anna Tapp, and I was wondering if you believed that any war was justified, and if so, which American war that we entered do you believe was justified?
I mean, obvious answer is World War II. But
Right.
then,
Sure.
You could argue that's not. I mean, you could argue no war is justified.
Right.
So, but to me, that's the only one.
I've always kind of tried to live my life by the maxim that if you feel the need to justify something, it probably wasn't right to begin with, right? And because if you're already asking yourself those kinds of questions, then you've already got a moral problem, and that's something worth considering. But I mean, there are times, as unsavory as it is, that force is necessary. I'm going to say the American Civil War, I mean, is a war that had to happen. That was a war that wasn't going to work any other way. We kicked it down the road with multiple incredible compromises, but that was the only way that was ever going to happen.
I'm going to go way out on a limb, and I'm going to say most of the wars that we've been involved in have been justified. I think certainly World War II. I think certainly the Civil War. I think World War I mean, we were very much under attack. I think War of 1812, I think our sovereignty was being trampled over. I think most of the major wars, Mexican War, I certainly will acknowledge was a bad idea. I mean, it worked out well for us, but it's not something I would try to justify morally or ethically. I mean, the kind of pseudo wars, Vietnam, not in the win category for me. I think Korea. I think the defense of the Korean people and our involvement there we were probably on the right side of history there. So I would say actually most of them.
Anytime that you have a group of people that's facing immediate oppression or is about to, I think that this, it's going to sound counterintuitive maybe, but the civilized thing to do is to march to war and defend those people who cannot defend themselves. And especially from a liberal democracy standpoint, I think that because, and I mean this is biased obviously, but I think that's the best kind of ocracy.
Mm-hmm.
And we should help people to at least get to the platform where they can, try to attain that for themselves. But some people need to be defended, and I think a defensive measure is necessary at times. And so, go on the offense to help that, right?
Yeah. I mean, you could say that not killing in some situations is immoral. Like you have to do certain things in order to protect the larger goal, the larger number of people. So, you could argue both sides of just about every war.
Is it more immoral to stand by and let people be slaughtered, genocides or whatever it is?
Right.
I think there's a greater immorality in not doing anything.
Well, and you can even get into the Sikh morality here. The idea that the foremost duty of a good person is to defend the weak, even if it means laying down your own life. So, if that's your standard, which I think is a reasonable one, then yeah, that kind of changes the equation a little bit.
Right.
All right, very good. Next question.
I'm Brittany Loy, and what are some inequalities between the sexes that still take place today in America, considering there isn't a single country who can declare that they are truly gender equal?
Okay.
The question was about gender equality issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's something we're dealing with, right? We're trying to figure out this is a very tricky thing because what would a country look like that is completely gender equal? And
How do you
would
know
that
when
be-
you've how do you know when you've achieved that?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
again, I go back to what I said a while ago. Everything's relative. Like
Mhm.
everybody has their own reality. And I was trying to explain this the other day to some folks. Like, there's a difference between reality and actuality. Like, reality is connected to the word relative, which means it's your personal sort of viewpoint that matters. And so, is how you feel more real than what is actually happening? If I feel oppressed compared to someone else in a similar situation who doesn't, am I right or are they right? So, I mean, I don't know how do you get to the point where every individual feels perfectly comfortable and confident that their rights are not being, suctioned away from them in some way or limited.
Right. I mean,
It's
I grew
tricky.
up. I can remember growing up around so many just very strong women who had made their own way, and and that was just kind of my model for what femininity was. And then started interacting with other people after high school, and remember getting into a fierce argument with this female group that was claiming that women don't belong in the military and they don't belong in a combat role, and firmly believed that about their own gender and their own sex. And so I think you're exactly right that there's not necessarily ever going to be a common agreement that yes, we have obtained this. And feminism itself is a good example of this, because what it begins as is seeking this true equality, is in some sectors of it has morphed into this no, you need superiority for a little while to try to balance things out. So everybody's definition for what that's going to represent is going to be so wildly different.
Segueing from that into this, like, what do you think about the recent decision to push for women to no longer be exempt from the draft?
That's the
Did you
equal
see-
rights
did you
amendment
see this recently?
thing.
Mm-hmm.
I
It's
don't-
something that we've kicked around before.
Yeah, I mean, but if we're thinking about, I mean, isn't that a symbol of equality?
I don't think we should have a selective service system to begin
Well, I mean,
with.
that's
I
a
think
different
it's a waste of money.
That's a different thing. But I
anyway.
mean, since we do,
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
is it right for one gender to be exempt?
No.
Agreed. No.
If we're going to have it, then it should be equal across the board.
Yeah.
Everybody signs up for it.
All right, so jumping back on what you said, then your argument against a selective service process would be what?
I think it's expensive. I think that the money would be better spent elsewhere. I think we haven't needed it since the conflict in Vietnam, so it's something that
Because
probably
of-
most of the people in this room.
Because of the gigantic volunteer force that we've been able to
Exactly.
amass?
Well, and I think the American military the military has changed. Armed conflict has changed.
Right.
We don't need massive numbers, at least not any foreseeable conflict. We don't need these massive numbers of infantry divisions coming ashore at D-Day. That's just not the way things work anymore. And the American military, and really every successful military, have come to the conclusion that, at least for larger nations, ideally you have a volunteer military. And not to mention, I think it's redundant because most of the information that's in the selective service system is better accessible, easier to access other places. I don't maintain my selective service records. My guess is nobody does. But the DMV knows who I am and how old I am and roughly how much I weigh and various other demographic details. Do I need corrective lenses? Would I be disqualified from flying an airplane because my eyes are too bad? The DMV has that.
So you're not against a draft per se, just the fact that it's a redundancy in the system and we don't really need it.
Even veterans are, they'll be the first to say they're glad we have a volunteer. I think, but once again, we're living in a time where we don't need the massive. Like, if you go back 100 years, then would you promote equality of the sexes in a draft? When you're doing cavalry charges and you're fighting, that's a different thing because men are just biologically stronger.
Right.
Than women. They have faster reflexes, generally speaking. So, like, if it was a random draft and sex didn't matter, and just randomly 70% of your army turns out to be female, and you're going up against.
Yeah, that's why I was hoping that
these are questions that
somebody was going to bring that up. And what if you? I mean, what are the disqualifications since there is a difference biologically?
Right. And I don't know what the answer to that is, because there's just certain physiological facts, and in some ways we're hardwired in certain ways too. So an interesting thing is like for fighter pilots, they've got these computer voices that talk to them, and if they black out, there's the voice that pull up, pull up, pull up. Well, if it's a male pilot, the computer voice is always female, and if it's a female pilot, the voice is always male. The subconscious brain will respond to something differently to that opposite sex, and we're more likely to respond to it.
We're used to getting ordered around by women. Not true.
Well, and that can work in both directions too. I've seen that used as the argument against the women's combat role, because a lot of the male brain, whether it's learned or innate behavior, kind of goes save the woman. And so, do you compromise the mission dealing with that instinct sometimes? But at the same time, I think that's a much broader kind of thing than we're necessarily looking at. It's something that I've noticed more and more, like that masculine pronouns are just our standard, right? If you are talking about a position of power vaguely, you're almost always going to use he or him.
I am going to do that.
So start paying attention to it. It's incredible that if you're referring to a judge or an attorney, you'll almost always use a masculine pronoun.
Yeah, and you assume certain things. Like there was this joke that people used to tell about a doctor, and you immediately just assumed the doctor was a man.
Right.
If you didn't say the gender. But I think these things are kind of wired in over,
I think it's less true than it used to be.
I think so too. I mean, I think this is changing, obviously. Equality of opportunity is pretty much all we can shoot for, right? If we're going to give everybody choice. But this goes back to the whole UFC thing, because we have people transgender, they're born biologically a man, they they become a woman. Should they be able to fight against women? And that's a big in sports, tennis or whatever. And this is a controversial thing, Right. So
I'm actually going to disagree with everyone on the entire premise here. Nice. So let me go out on a limb here. I disagree with the whole idea that there are biological differences between genders. And by that, what I mean is we don't draft genders, we draft individuals. Every time we've had a draft, before you are accepted into military service, you are given a physical, you are given an exam. There are lots of men that are excluded. There are certainly women that are far more qualified. I taught at a military college, and I'm telling you, every female officer cadet in that school could have eaten my lunch any day of the week. They would have destroyed me. I am fat. I am blind. I am in no condition. At the point at which you are drafting me, surrender. It's over. America lost. We had a good run. Probably every woman in this room right now would make a better soldier than me, and I'm man enough to admit it. So I think you do, if you're going to have a selective service system, you absolutely have men and women in the database, because you're going to have a lot of guys like me, and you're going to have a lot of 19-year-old softball stars that could run circles around me while I'm dying of a coronary.
Yeah, I'm sure.
That's completely valid.
Yeah, we're making generalities, so it's hard to.
Yeah. And I just wonder what the statistical differences are, if there are any, that have been established. So.
And my suggestion would, and I completely understand what you guys are doing. I think it's an important point to make, and I think if you're going to have a selective service system, have everybody in it, and then make those individual determinations. Exclude the old fat historians. Tell me, don't worry about it. You stay home, buddy. And then you bring in the young, tough females that could maybe actually be. Does
that change though? Now that we've talked about going going further away from, invading troops and more sort of digital communications and controlling things from a distance. Could more people then be qualified?
Well, they could be, and qualified in different ways, because things like eye-hand coordination or computer skills become far more important than being able to do 100 push-ups. And the jobs are all different as well.
Yep. All right, cool. Agreed. All right, next question.
Hi, I'm Lily Crabtree, and I was just wondering if you think a Women's Empowerment Month is justified.
A Women's Empowerment Month, is that something that people are? This is the month. Oh well, how uninformed am I?
And here we are without. You guys dropped the ball here. You guys run the podcast. You should have had.
Wow.
You should have had a woman up here. Abby, come on up here.
Somebody take my place. Anybody?
Just dudes across the board. Is it justified? Is that what you're asking? Where'd you go? Yeah, do we need that?
I wouldn't argue against it.
Well,
Right.
why stop with a month? I mean, it's the same argument that I've heard when
Black
we say,
History Month.
why do we need? Why is every month not just? Why does it have to be women's history or whatever selective group we want to pick out? Like, all history is everyone's history, and so I think if we ever get to that point, or maybe it's because they've been purposefully excluded in the previous versions of historical context, then we feel like we need to amplify that. I mean, I think that's true. I would probably say yes, a justification, because if I think about groups that have faced oppression in any way and have been in the conversation about their particular dealings have been limited, then yeah, why not?
Mm-hmm. I think I'm in the same boat, that there's a trend in trying to specifically recognize historically ignored or excluded groups. I think is a good thing. I don't think that needs a justification, though. But realizing how excluded it is from the story, I think is totally valid. Like, I'm sitting here trying to use our DNA scientists that kind of originate this as an example, and I've got Watson and I've got Crick, and the woman who actually did most of the work that they took credit for, even though I know her story and know she exists, I sit here and I can't remember her name. And that's problematic. And that's a personal problem, but that's also a how we teach those kinds of histories
Franklin?
problem.
Is that her name? I'm sorry. I think her last name's Franklin. Anyway. All right. Next question.
Hi, I'm Raymond, and I have a question for that I've sent you and Mr. Pumphrey a video yesterday, I believe, about why America was never isolationist, and I just want to hear your opinion if you think America was isolationist or not.
The part of the problem with that word, I think, is that while we have a tendency to, we're very sort of cultural centric, America first mentality, and that's been a vibrant part of who we've been for a long time. But we've always sort of interacted with other people, regardless of that. I mean, we build let's go ahead and face it, we build our empire based on connectivity. Like, you can't be an isolationist empire. That's not the way it works. And so, yeah, I don't buy I think the mentality is to pull back and not necessarily be involved in other people's drama. Let's use World War I and II. We wanted to stay out of their mess and not be drawn into it. But at the same time, like, we were definitely never really just sort of here by ourselves on our own without any kind of vision of other people that we could incorporate into the system right? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with that, because we're only isolationist to the extent that we didn't want to get involved with our military. We are more than happy to sell goods to both sides and profit from both wars as much as humanly possible, right? Which is what ultimately winds up drawing us into both of them, too. So, yeah, there is, and if you take the word isolationist and try to take it in its most strict definition, then no, there is no such thing. So it's semantics, I think.
While we were busy being isolationists in World War I, we were all kinds of happy to interfere with whatever was going on in Latin America to try to influence their electoral process, their economic process, their production value, and their levels of. I mean, we're doing that out of a self-interest.
Right.
That's not isolationist. I mean, I guess in a weird way, because we were more concerned about ourselves than other people.
I mean, we won the Revolutionary War in 1783, and then right after that sent John Adams, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, to be the diplomat to London. So immediately the people were fighting, okay, now let's establish diplomatic relations, let's get this trade thing going. So we've been, it's not, just in certain ways we might have been more isolated.
Would you consider the isolationist the idea that we're trying to keep other people out now that we've established, solid borders, coast to coast?
I don't think that's new to our story either.
No, I don't mean that. But could that be a factor in considering, yes, we were isolationists, meaning we don't want other people coming in here. And we've done that as a country several times.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's indicative of our anxiety, because there's a difference in withdrawing from a role as world police and a difference in relinquishing that world influence, world power. I think that's just anxiety, that if we pull troops back, does that mean that we're losing that influence? And it doesn't have to.
Yeah. So, yeah, I can make an argument both ways. I mean, obviously, we were more concerned about getting dragged into some sort of, European. You know, Britain and France was fighting all the time. I think that's kind of the only measuring stick for what maybe we consider isolationist.
It probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. It comes down to your definition of isolationism. If by isolationism you mean that we have no engagement with the rest of the world, then no, absolutely not. We've never been isolationist. If you mean by isolationist that we try really hard to stay out of direct military confrontation and direct military alliances with other powers, then yes, by that measure, we absolutely have been isolationist at various times. So it just depends on, and I don't say that to dodge the question. It just becomes, what do you mean by the word isolationist? Because it means a lot of different things.
Yeah, and we can declare neutrality, yet at the same time give a bunch of weapons and money. And so are you
Right.
really neutral? I mean, you know,
Yeah.
we could talk about that forever. All right, very good. Next question.
Brittany Loigan, back
Hello.
to the topic of feminism. Why do you think there is a stereotype around feminism when the definition is about equality of the sexes rather than being superior to men? And what do you think we could do to diminish this stereotype?
These are complicated questions, obviously. I have the answer. You know, I think it's, first of all, with social media, things I think get magnified to a degree, so it's hard to figure out what reality is versus perception. I think both the gender inequality issue, racism, all of these social issues have gotten consistently better over time. Obviously, it's better now than it was in the 90s. It's better now than it was in the 80s. And if you keep going back, it just seems to get worse and worse in both of these issues. The question is, what does the finish line look like? And that's hard to determine.
If you go back and study the history of feminism in this country specifically, though, there's no clear answer even from the movement itself, because it's multiple movements all at the same time. And it goes back to what I said a while ago with the reality versus actuality. Like, everybody has their own definition inside the movement, whether they're men or women, because there are, you know, males in the feminist movement as well. And everybody sort of has their own sort of ending point where, like, hey, we've achieved this, and others like, no, we haven't gone far enough. And how much more strongly do you need to voice that in the separation between, like, it sort of is with every group, and I'm not trying to distill this, but at the same time, with every group that is rising up to try to challenge status quo mentality that's been holding it down in any way, shape, or form, like, the movement itself tends to disagree with what it wants ultimately, and that ends up slowing the whole process down. Or one group wants to go much farther than the others, and they seem militant by comparison, and then other people jump on the bandwagon and say, "Oh, we see how horrible this has become, and we need to," like, it almost ends up creating a perpetual justification for keeping it down because it seems so radicalized. So I mean, I don't know how to answer that.
Well, and let's just take one little snippet, because y'all know about this. The gender pay gap is a real thing. I mean, obviously, if you just look at it, women, on the average, get paid less than men.
Are there certain industries that are worse than others, you think?
I'm sure there is. The problem, though, is we just try to say, well, it's because we're discriminating against women, which is a variable, one of like 15.
Right.
Because women tend to work less. Women tend, and these are all generalities, tend to take jobs in the caretaking more, you know, like teachers and nurses and things that tend to pay a little less. And there's maternity leave that you got to factor in with working less. And so there's 15 variables. And I think, how do you make society equal but still give everybody individual choice? Because I think we still want everybody to have freedom to make the choices they want to make in life. And thereby,
do you think that's the ultimate finish line then? That everybody can choose for themselves how they want to apply those things to their lives?
I think that's as good as we could hope for, is you have no external boundary just because of your sex for whatever you want to.
Because what's good enough for one person may be intolerable to the next person and go, I can't believe you settled for that. And others are like, I can't believe that you wouldn't settle for that. I don't know how you keep from... ultimately, it's what every individual person wants.
Did y'all read about the James Damore letter from Google?
No.
They were trying to tell Google needs to hire more women. That was kind of we need to hire more women, period. And he was writing he basically said, look, a lot of women don't want to go into tech fields. You know, it's not, they choose to do other things. And he got fired and, you know, just raked over the coals. But that's the thing, is like somebody said, well, look, our nation is 55% women or whatever. So shouldn't Congress be 55% women? I'm like, no, What if they all suck? You know, I want just whoever people want, and I want choice. I just want everybody. I think that's what equality is, right? We're not talking about equality of outcome. We can't force everybody to be equal, and you know, in like we can't. Okay, we're going to divide everything up 50. You know, I think all we can do is remove as many obstacles, societal and government and legal, and just as we can, but then just leave it up to choice for the natural separation of things. I mean.
I think I'm going to propose that the finish line partially looks like the removal of assumption, which ties right in with the choice, right? That just because I have this perspective of how things should be doesn't necessarily mean that your perspective is wrong or invalid or anything like that. And I think that's part of where some of those stereotypes come from, because I think women that are that are feminists sometimes feel as though they're being told that they're womening wrong, that they're feminizing wrong, and
we're mansplaining,
right? You know, or so. I think that if we can get to the point that we are removing those assumptions, I think that's where we're at, because there is a lot of, at least in this part of the world, a lot of good old boy society stuff that still absolutely plays a role. Even if you're looking at a government job that guarantees an equal salary across, and gender doesn't get to be taken into the hiring decision, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be treated equally in the workplace. And ultimately, do we want equality or do we want equity? Because they're not the same thing. Right. Because we could say that everybody has equal opportunity, kind of the American dream, and ultimately that's true, but the starting line isn't the same for everybody. Right. We might have equality of opportunity, but we don't have equity of opportunity. And I think the same kind of arguments could be made for feminism too.
Okay, very good. Who's next?
I'm going to change the topic a bit. I'm Brian Sarden. Okay, so if you had to argue against capitalism as a system, what would be your best argument?
I can remember sitting in economics.
That's a tiny question.
Right. I can remember sitting in economics 101 and being enraged that I was being told that I should be making my decisions on the short-term margin, that what it should dictate my decision is how I can make the most money in the least amount of time. And if that means that it blows up the world, hey, I made the most money in the least amount of time, and that should be what dictates all of my decisions. And I think capitalism tends toward that, making immoral decisions for the sake of the dollar. And I think that's the best argument against it.
Yeah, I think capitalism, to survive, naturally breeds a lower class. I mean, you have to have a working class in capitalism. You have to have ownership, which is generally the upper class of this class system. And at times, the class, you know, when we have a big middle class, and it seems to be going well, and then at times we have a huge separation gap between the rich and the poor, like we do now. The whole wage gap kind of is tough.
I've tried to explain capitalism in class by comparing it to a nuclear reactor. Like, the way that you keep a nuclear reactor safe is to put in control rods that slows down the reaction, that keeps it from going into overdrive and then melting through the core. And so if I think about capitalism, when we see it in its original form, when it was unregulated completely, in the let's use the 1800s as the example, the factory systems that just devoured people. It didn't care about the workers. It didn't have to care about the workers. It was just chase that dollar. Whoever can do. It's just that competitive drive. Eat everybody in your path and succeed. What we've done, and actually that was the impetus for what Marx and Engels were arguing, why it was evil, because it was just chewing people up and spitting them out. That's what it was designed to do, and it was dangerous. And only the few people who were really at the top of that, who were sort of above the danger zone, were the ones that were really benefiting most from that. But the bulk of humanity was like suffering because of it. And so we need revolution to stop it, because it's gonna kill all these people. But what we learned to do, this is the beauty of what's happened since then, is that we've learned to put those control rods in place. We've learned to regulate it. We've learned to slow that process down when we need to give it those safety measures so that we don't crush the workers, so that we give, I mean, if you can moderate that, right? Keep the cooling systems in place. Every time we deregulate capitalism and we let it just kind of run because it wants to, it blows up in our face, and it can be dangerous. And so to be able to take control factors in and out as necessary to make sure that we're keeping that safe zone. We want people to be able to earn money as much as they possibly can based on their talents or their their entrepreneurship, but at the same time, not let them walk on the people that are getting them there.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of build on what you said, if the question is what is the best argument against, and I think the students said capitalism, but we'll say just completely unfettered capitalism, because capitalism can mean a million different things. So we'll just say completely unchecked, unregulated, anything goes capitalism. My biggest argument against that system is that, to the best of my knowledge, no serious person has ever argued in favor of it. Even Adam Smith, who's very much the modern, father of laissez-faire capitalism, he very much talks about you have to have a civil society, you have to have laws, you have to have enforcement of laws. So yeah, that would be my argument. Nobody's seriously argued for it.
Yeah, he argued a moral component to capitalism.
Right.
So people forget that.
Right?
So
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, regulated capitalism, but the argument, of course, against it is how a mass number of people can be put in the worst, slavery, antebellum slavery. You could just look at that. There was more millionaires in Mississippi than anywhere else, and a tiny, 70+% of the slaves were owned by a tiny percent of the plantation. It was getting worse and worse. So
the planter class.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we're starting to see those kind of arguments spring back up. Like more and more, the conversation is billionaires even a thing that should exist? And that's a different kind of approach to capitalistic criticisms, right? That the hyper wealthy is actually bad for this whole system as a whole. And
well, it looks like the Democrats are going to push some things through that might test all that.
Speaking of billionaires, you see the list of the youngest billionaires, like the newest list. Did y'all see this?
Right.
The newest, youngest billionaire?
Kylie Jenner.
Kardashian, Kardashian. Right. Yeah, so do you consider her a self-made billionaire? Some people said no, because she's like basing it on her family's fame. But other people said, you know what? She yeah, that's what I've heard. Like she actually used a lot of that. The foundation for her makeup company was just based on the modeling that she did. So I mean,
hey, I'm telling you, is that part of the Kardashians?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to bash them all the time, but you know what? They've been around for a while now. I mean, if you walked around with a camera crew and followed me around, you know how boring that would be. But they've kept it going. They got rich off of it. So.
Right. Just because you get to
more power to them.
Right. Just because you get to start with a lot doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't self-make it. I think we kind of discount how hard it is.
They didn't start with $1 billion.
Right. I think
she didn't anyway.
We discount how hard it is to keep it and then to grow it. I mean, look at the results of lottery winners and how many of them are back in a ditch within 5 years.
Yeah.
So
wasn't there a show, The Lottery Ruined My Life?
If there wasn't, there should have been.
I thought there was. Yeah. No, I don't know anything about them personally. I don't have a clue. I've not seen their shows, but at the same time, I mean, if you want to, everybody knows their names. They've been excellent at promoting who they are and what they want to be and making the money they want to make. So that's capitalism right there. Isn't that feminism? Regardless of how they got there, if they did it their way, doesn't that count?
Chris Rock used to say he liked to watch the draft because when some poor kid, high school kid from the projects, they make it in basketball or football, whatever it goes. As soon as they signed that check, it's just a countdown to when they're going to be poor again. Oh. And it's just like, you never learn how to hang on to the money, and so it is. It's difficult to keep it rolling. Okay, last question for the podcast.
My name is Erica Jones, and I just wanted to know, what conspiracy theories do you agree with the most, and which do you think are the most absurd?
Aliens.
The conspiracy that there is Western civilization.
I think.
Do explain.
What?
Somebody asked Gandhi one time, "What do you think about Western civilization?" He said, "I think it'd be a great idea."
Yeah.
I think our founding fathers conspired to start a war with England to get for our independence. So
wait, so what? Say that again. What?
Our founding fathers conspired to start a war with England. I believe in that conspiracy. Conspiracies happen all the time. It just depends on what angle you look at it from. What's did the JFK, I guess? And what do y'all think? Yeah or no?
About JFK?
Single shooter?
As far as I can tell.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, have you ever been to the book depository?
No, but I heard you talk about it.
It's not that far from where Oswald was to where the president was, and you could easily make that shot. Even a half-ass marksman could make that shot.
Right.
I mean, no offense, but it wasn't that the angle was right, the distance wasn't that far, and you could crack that out, reload, do it again and again. And I think it's possible that it was a single shooter.
Right, and the argument is always like how many shots were fired, right? How many that the audio recordings pick up. I think what all of those kind of multiple shooter arguments miss is that echoes are a thing, especially in a city with tall buildings, and so I think those multiple shots that people are hearing are echoes coming back.
Makes sense.
Yeah. You'd think somebody would have talked by now or something. It's been a while.
Right.
Moon landing? Did we land on the moon?
Yes.
Yes.
Of course.
Is the Earth flat?
No.
In spots.
Have you seen the Have you seen the Netflix documentary about flat earthers trying to scientifically prove that it's flat? It's fantastic because as they perform experiment after experiment that proves that it's spherical, and watch the gears grind.
Hey, there's space
magical.
deniers now.
Wait a
There's
minute, what?
Growing space deniers. They deny
That there
there's
is
actual
space?
There's no space. This is it. They deny that there is space. That's been
What are
fed
you
to us.
watching?
I don't know where I heard that. That's not. I can't believe it. Yeah.
So like the Truman Show,
Yeah,
except
this is
for
our little
Antarctica.
bubble.
Oh no.
Yeah, obviously.
No, that's crazy. No, I haven't heard that that's a thing.
Bigfoot.
You know what? There are Bigfoot believers.
There are some.
I know some. You know what? That one's intriguing though, because there's still a lot of open space in this country. Could there be things out there that we haven't discovered yet? Maybe. I don't know if I don't necessarily buy the humanoid, half man, half ape, missing link kind of thing, but right. I don't know that there's not some room out there for things like that to sort of just distance themselves.
If there's something out there that
I don't know.
that's pretty big that we haven't, it's going to be in the ocean. We have explored a tiny percent of the ocean.
You think Big Feet leaving the ocean?
Maybe that's a Loch Ness monster.
Right.
Big fin.
The Kraken. There's something in that, but yeah.
Right. I mean, all of that got started with the video in the 60s, the 70s,
Mhm.
and we've stabilized that now and clarified it into just so very clearly a guy in a costume.
Yeah. And the problem with these people is they want to believe.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I grew up a country kid out in the woods. Like, it is remarkable how much a person, a black bear that decides to walk on its hind legs for a little while looks, especially through the underbrush and the darkness. Like, it looks like a person walking around out there.
What about
I don't think there are those, but I still.
There was a big
part of me
ape that did exist with humans.
Part of me wants to
thousands of
believe
years
there's
ago.
all these cool things out there that we haven't found yet.
Yeah.
I don't really believe. I think I was telling somebody this the other day. I don't believe in ghosts, but I want to. You know what I mean? I don't believe in aliens, but I want to. So this is the kind of same thing with Bigfoot. I really don't think it's there, but it'd be kind of cool if there was.
That's the thing with aliens too, right? And Fermi's paradox, all that. We don't have time to go into all that, but. All right. Well, hey, this has been fun.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Collective Coffee.
everyone.
Thanks for having us.
Yes. Goodbye.